Good evening and happy Christmas. My name is Mitchell Daniels, board member here with the Whitby Historical Society and Lindhouse Museum. And welcome to Scary Victorian Christmas Traditions. In the 1990s, Tim Burton released his very popular film, A Nightmare Before Christmas, which told the story of Jack Skellington's adventures into Christmastown and the combination of both Christmas and Halloween. Now, though that film itself is a work of fiction, in reality there is actually quite a bit of truth behind the matter. In fact, many of the Christmas traditions that were observed during the Victorian era, we would more so associate with today's Halloween traditions. During the Victorian era, we begin to see the introduction of the Christmas card, which was actually initially created by one of the first directors of the Victorian and Albert Museum in London. Now, these Christmas cards, however, were not necessarily the same types of Christmas cards that we would be accustomed to receiving. These Christmas cards often included things such as dead birds, killer frogs, killer cockroaches, and killer snowmen. And so these cards acted more so as a conversation starter rather than your traditional Christmas greeting. The Victorians were also obsessed with the paranormal and the idea of spiritualism. And of course, this began to create a rise in popularity of the idea of in-house paranormal investigations, as well as the rise in the practice of hiring a medium to come and contact the dead. Particularly during the holiday season, families would often gather primarily in upper-class households for mummy unwrapping parties. Sounds like a very interesting Christmas indeed. And of course, the strange traditions didn't necessarily stop there, and some of the slightly dangerous traditions even continued into some of the games that they played. Perhaps most famously, the game of Snapdragon, a game that would involve putting whiskey or another type of alcohol on a large pile of fruit, primarily either currants or raisins, and lighting it on fire, and then trying to grab and eat each of the different raisins before the alcohol went out. Now, around the same time, we also had the Civil War in the United States, and as a result, hundreds became very unsure whether or not their loved ones would return from the war effort. When the holidays approached, numerous different stories began to emerge of Civil War soldiers who had been reported missing, suddenly coming back from the dead only to disappear before sunset. With this rise in spiritualism and ghost stories, of course, also arose the practice of the Christmas ghost story. Now, unfortunately, this practice really hasn't continued into present day. However, there are still a few examples of Christmas ghost stories that we still love to tell each other during the Christmas holidays. The most famous being, of course, Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Another popular one that comes to mind is The Little Match Girl. And now tonight, I'd like to reintroduce you to one that has sort of been lost to time. This one dates from 1891 and is called The Faithful Ghost. I was only a yee lad when I first met Johnson. It was the Christmas holidays, and as a result, I was allowed to stay up very late. And when it finally came time for me to go into my little bedroom, I opened the door to my bedroom and came face to face with the ghost of Johnson who was coming out. He let out a low, horrifying moan and proceeded directly through me, down the hallway, and out the stairwell window. I was in a complete state of terror. As I mentioned, I was only a lad at the time and had never seen a ghost before. But upon further reflection, I remembered that it was only sinful people whose spirits could do any harm to, and so proceeded into my room, tucked myself in, and had a jolly good night's sleep. The next morning, I told my father what I'd seen. "Oh, yes, that was old Johnson," he said. "No need to fear the likes of him. He lives here." And then he told me the poor thing's story. It seems that Johnson, when he was alive, had, in early life, loved the daughter of the former lessee of this house, a young girl by the name of Emily. Now, during this time, wealth and status was everything. And so, unfortunately, the poor Johnson, he simply couldn't afford to raise a family in his current living conditions. And so he kissed his dear Emily goodbye and went off to Australia to go make his fortune. But Australia was not then what it would later become. So it took him nearly 20 years to make his fortune, and by the time he had evaded the authorities and escaped back to England, he came to try and find his dear Emily. But she was nowhere to be found, and upon asking the neighbors had said that after only a very, very short time after Johnson's departure, that Emily and her family had, on one foggy night, mysteriously disappeared. Now, many of the local tradesmen and many of the neighbors had made searching inquiries, but to no avail. Johnson searched the world for his beloved Emily before finally returning back to the home where, in the early days of his life, he and his beloved Emily had spent so many wonderful hours together. In the final years of his life, he would pace back and forth from each room of the house, calling desperately to his Emily. But she would never return. And when the poor fellow died, his ghost kept up the business, still traveling from room to room looking for his dear, dear, dear Emily, who he had lost now so many years ago. And that's where my father came in. You see, after Johnson's passing, the home had been put up for sale, and as a result of the suspected hauntings, the agent had actually even taken off £10 a year. And so, when my father inherited the house, and from that day on that I had seen the ghost of Johnson, we would repeatedly see him as he would pass through the different passageways and hallways and rooms of the house. Over time, Johnson became just another fixture of the house, and in the early days, we would move aside and let it pass by. However, as we grew accustomed to having Johnson living amongst us, there seemed no such need for such ceremony, and so we eventually just decided to let him pass right through us. He was, in general, a harmless ghost, and the womenfolk indeed took quite a liking to him, and very much made him into one of their pets. But over time, Johnson became a bit of a bore, mainly because, of course, he was full of sorrow. There was nothing cheerful or joyous about him. He would sit on the stairs and mourn for hours and cry for hours at a stretch. And when we had a party on, he would spend all night sobbing outside of the drawing room door. One evening, when myself and my family were sitting down to a good game of whist, Johnson's moaning made the game absolutely impossible to complete, so that none of us could even decide and determine what was suit or what was trump. Finally, my father, outraged by this constant annoyance, said, "I've had just about enough with that Johnson. I wish there was some way we could get rid of him." And my mother said, "Well, you know, dear, there's really only one way to get rid of him. And that is, of course, to find his beloved Emily." The trouble was, of course, that none of us knew where Emily was any more than the ghost of Johnson himself did. We made a few more inquiries, and the governor of our local area suggested that we could perhaps pawn off another dead Emily's grave to this poor sap. But as luck would have it, there was not a single dead Emily's grave from miles around. In fact, on a side note, I haven't really come across a town with a complete lack of dead Emily's than this one, of course. And so, of course, upon further reflection, I suggested, well, couldn't we just create a fake grave of Emily's? He seems like a simple-minded old chap. Perhaps he might believe it and buy it. And my father said, well, it certainly couldn't hurt to try. So we hired the workmen who came out and dug a small hole in the back garden and put a fake gravestone that read, "In memory of our beloved Emily, whose last words were, 'Tell Johnson I love him.'" But the question still remained. Would it work? We will have to see, said Father. And indeed, the next evening we lured the ghost of Johnson down to the grave. And I'll never forget it. It was perhaps one of the most pathetic things I had ever seen, the way that ghost transcended upon the grave and started crying buckets. Indeed, it was a very emotional experience. Mr. Squibbins and my father, Mr. Squibbins, I should mention, is my gardener, they cried like children when they saw it, and indeed, Johnson has thankfully never bothered us in the house since then. He spends every night now sobbing and mourning outside of the grave, and seems quite happy. Is he there now? Oh, yes. And I'll show him to you the next time you come around. Until then, my fair listener, Happy Christmas. And to all,